Thank you. I run a taxpayer group. We try and keep taxes somewhat down and spending somewhat under control. But I started politically as an anti-communist and came from a foreign policy perspective when I first got involved in politics. And I think it's very important. I want to talk from the standpoint of center-right Reagan Republicans, because they get to run the House now, and have not always been involved in this conversation about how much is enough on defense. I think to a certain extent a lot of folks on the right assume they had to push, the left was against having enough defense to compete with the Soviet Union, and we just had to push for as much as we could get, and as much as we could get, given that the left was trying to undercut us, wasn't going to be enough, but so we just pushed as hard as we could get. And at some point when the other team stopped pushing against us, and when the Soviet Union disappeared, a lot of people on the right failed to notice that this wasn't quite there weren't guardrails here somewhere that were somehow going to keep us spending at a reasonable level. The other one is that Republicans and center-right activists, conservatives, really need to avoid falling into what we recognize as the complete disingenuousness of the left when they talk about spending as a synonym for concern. Now, we think it's silly when Democrats and liberals say, well, if you don't spend more money on education, you don't care about education. We make a distinction between how much money the government spends on something like education in D.C. and how much education actually takes place. We recognize that spending is not a synonym for concern, and it is not a synonym for results. And yet, too often, those on the center-right presume, they recognize, you go down a list of 115 different government programs, they say spending more doesn't necessarily get you more. They get to defense, cops, and prisons, and they go, well, spending more gets you more. Really? Always? Sometimes? And so I think it's helpful that we have that conversation and keep that in mind so that we don't end up being dishonest in our conversation as we sometimes view the other team as being less than honest when they equate spending other people's money and concern or results. The other one was briefly mentioned. Cutting a budget is not the same thing as spending less than somebody else had imagined they might, okay? Cutting a budget is to spend less tomorrow than you spent today, not to spend less tomorrow than some third party thought would be fun to spend today. And budgeting against projections, or worse, projections of needs, which are infinitely elastic on all government spending programs, is problematic. And again, those in the center-right, we recognize this immediately when you say, well, this is what the left does on welfare and education and any number of different projects. Yes, that's very dishonest. And how do we approach the defense budget and military spending? And there's a model here for those in the center-right in terms of thinking this through, and that is a recent conversation that's just beginning to happen, although legislation's passed, so it's not just an idea, and that is the rethinking that's taking place on Right on Crime, which is a group of conservative activist leaders, legislators, guys like Gingrich and Ed Meese, who are trying to rethink what is good criminal justice policy. Is putting more people in prison for longer periods of time who are guilty of violating some rule always a good idea? Sometimes a good idea? How much money do you spend on it? And is spending on the criminal justice system the same thing as reducing crime? And this is important, and I think the model here is that those in the center-right bring some credibility to the idea we want to fight crime and perhaps spend less money, or fight crime but do it in different ways than we've been doing it in the past. The left doesn't have the same level of credibility because people don't, the independent voters don't view that they have credibility on, oh, we want to fight crime. Really? Where were you X? The same thing with defense. Center-right political activists, Reagan Republicans, have credibility in saying we want to take national defense seriously, but that doesn't mean you spend every dollar that some bureaucrat can imagine spending. And so I think it's particularly incumbent on those in the center-right, one, because they can do in the debate what folks on the left, who might agree with them on a final number or even a strategy of where we get to, but they have credibility with voters that does not exist on the left, both in criminal justice reform and on defense spending questions. Also, if people on the center-right intend to run the government over the next 40 or 50 years, as opposed to stand on the side and whine about how other people are running the government, we ought to start with those bits of the government that we think ought to exist. And if you were building from scratch, there'd be a Defense Department. There may be some other buildings in this town that would not be built if we were starting from scratch. If we weren't doing it already, would you start, asks Drucker. And the answer is having national defense to keep the Canadians on their side of the border is probably one of the places you'd start, and you would want to have a national defense. So how about having center-right Reagan Republicans decide that we will focus on doing that properly and well, while the other team messes up much of the rest of the government while we busy figure out how to shut it down, but let's at least run correctly, properly, well, that part which we recognize and argue is actually like shows up in the Constitution from time to time. I do want to mention, you talked about where we go from here. A week or so ago, I made the suggestion that on the center-right we have a discussion about conversation, about how long the occupation of Afghanistan continues. How much are we spending on it? Could we get some numbers? How long do we plan to be there? What does winning like? What are we doing? Where are we going? Why are we doing it? And I think that having that conversation is necessary and important. And again, not just on defense spending, but on some of these policy questions, too many on the right say, well, the Republican president said we needed to do this, and I saluted, and I haven't thought about it in 10 years. And the question is, do you really want to take, do you want to have inertia guide policy? Well, we did it 10 years ago, so we're going to keep doing it for another 10 years, for 100 years, for 6 months. What are we thinking? And just because fearless leaders said it was a good idea is not necessarily a good reason to continue a policy. The flip side of that is the left's against it, so we're for it. This is the old, the left likes whales and they don't like nuclear weapons, so we must be for nuking the whales. That works from time to time. Vote against Bella Abzug. I get it, okay? If you don't know what else is going on, vote against the way Bella Abzug shows up on the board. But that's not really a plan, and it doesn't work all the time, and it's really not the way to reason to something. And perhaps just because somebody on the left criticized Bush's approach is not necessarily an argument that we can't rethink this. So we ought to be having, again, a conversation. And I was a little bit surprised at the weakness of the advocates of the status quo, because I thought, let's have a conversation. They'd go, yes, let's have a conversation. Let me tell you the 10 reasons why this that's going on is on purpose, and this is what we planned, and this is good, and you're missing all the good bits, and it really is the French are paying for it. Or there's some collection of arguments that some of us might have missed. Instead, we sort of got shut up, he explained, and we've always done it this way, which is the letters you see. We've always spent this much money, so I don't know what you're whining about. That wasn't a good argument for any number, for polygamy or any number of things that have been going on for large periods of time. That said, again, I think this is something where the center-right really needs to focus on these questions of how much we spend and on what. And again, to have a conversation. And the good news is that because of the credibility, because of the history of the Cold War and so on, the center-right has a credibility the left does not have. They can take this forward in ways that a Democratic president can't. And the other argument you sometimes get is, well, if you save all the money that could be saved in defense, it doesn't solve all the world's problems. It doesn't solve all the budget problems. Well, that's an argument against taking the first step on any journey. That's an argument against doing anything because that which you do today won't solve all the world's problems. And that's true on all questions of budget restraint. No one decision is going to solve all of our concerns, but that's not a grown-up argument against making progress in that direction. Thank you.